Test, Palais Wilson, ground floor pour le webcast. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Canal anglais. Canal anglais, le canal 2.
Good morning, Dobry Utra. I call to order meeting number 35 of the 78th session of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It is my great pleasure to welcome again this morning the distinguished delegation of the Russian Federation and the head of the delegation, His Excellency Mr. Andrei Tudov. I would also like to welcome other members of the delegation from the Russian Federation, as also those observing the dialogue in person and through webcast. We would like to invite the delegation to continue responding to questions that were pending from yesterday under Cluster 2 for a maximum of 15 minutes, Your Excellency, after which we would proceed to respond to questions posed yesterday on Cluster 3 up to 30 minutes. After that, follow-up questions to all clusters will be posed, and then Mr. Ashraf Kanhai will pose questions on Cluster 4, and the delegation will have approximately 30 minutes to respond to those. To facilitate this process and to enable us to cover the full range of issues at hand, I would like to invite my colleagues and the distinguished delegation to speak in a concise manner, giving due attention to time allocation. Here, I'd also like to emphasize that for ease of interpretation, if we could all kindly keep in mind to speak a little slowly and clearly into the microphone so that our interpreters are able to comprehend and have the time enough to interpret on time. With this, I have the pleasure to give the floor to the delegation. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Madam Chair, distinguished members, a very good morning to you on behalf of the Russian Federation. And with that, we will begin the answers on Cluster 2. And the first regarding the volume of social spending. Social support to citizens is a priority for Russia. The federal budget is geared to upholding incomes for citizens, including the more vulnerable categories. Figures. 2024, social policy was provided with 8.4 trillion rubles, 1,500 more than the previous year. Compared to 2019, it was 1.7 times more. And that is dependent on support measures for citizens and economic measures to ensure development of the economy in the context of the sanctions pressure. I should point to the fact that the social spending compliance has been 99.9%. In conclusion to that response, despite the difficult geopolitical economic situation, state obligations on indexation have been fully complied with. Absolutely all social payments have been increased, at least in line with inflation, and indeed more, 9.5% since February last year. Furthermore, question 2. On Cluster 2, there was a question about the poverty line and poverty levels in Russia. And we would say the following. To 2021, the minimum was considered on the basis of the consumer basket, which depended on prices. From 2021, we changed the legislation, and it is now based in line with mean income. The methodology is used also by other developed countries, making it possible to move from an assessment of material prosperity not based on basic needs, but on standards of prosperity as a whole. However, to ensure comparability of specific spending, the poverty levels to 2021 and afterwards were based on the poverty line concept, which is calculated dependent on inflation. and to using an overall method based on the basic poverty minimum compared with the consumer basket in the fourth quarter of 2020, which makes it possible to conduct observations accordingly. In 2019, the poverty level in Russia was 18 million, 400,000 people, 12.4% of the population. Over 5 years, we emphasize, thanks to the unprecedented social policy and support to vulnerable categories, the number has been reduced to a historic low, 7.2 million, 10.5 million people, 7.2%. And another comment. We have an instrument to combat low income, namely the social contract. In 2024, 204,000 were concluded, covering 500,000 people. And what's important is that over 60% of the recipients were families with children. Thanks to the social contract program, and we have a number of sub-programs, you can open a business, develop subsistence farming, take up employment, or just receive money, financial support in a difficult situation. So the goal is a long-term income for these people, and particularly for these families with children. Now, we looking at specific assistance to employment seekers. The social contract is for people who are registered as employed in particular, and then it's 1 minimum salary and 3 more as soon as the person gets a job. If we want to help someone open a business, then they receive up to 350,000 rubles, and we also pay for training in business skills. So that is on the poverty line, and on what we've done to combat poverty. Moving on to the next question, to which I want to give additional information. That was on low-income families with 1 child or more dependents. And here I want to give some important measures of support provided by our state. In particular, there's the one-off payment for pregnancy and childbirth paid to workers. In 2025, the maximum payment was almost 800,000 rubles. So that's on pregnancy and childbirth. Then there's a monthly childcare payment for workers, as I mentioned, up to 1.5 years. That is 68,000 maximum per month, rubles. Another important issue is the maternal capital, so-called, where the first child is born, the state provides that family with 690,000 rubles. If a second child is born, then it's over 900,000 rubles the sum paid, and that can be spent on buying housing, educating children, and in preschool education. In many cases, if it's a low-income family, that maternal capital can be received on a monthly basis for low-income families. Another important measure for social support from 2023, January, and that's for low-income families, where the mean income per capita is below the poverty line. For each child, then, we provide a child benefit. And that depends on the region where the family lives. On average, it's 17,000 rubles per child. So this is a targeted measure to support families with children whose income is below the subsistence minimum per capita. I've mentioned the social contract already. In addition, regionally, there are measures to support third and subsequent children. Most regions have a regional maternal capital, and that is additional to the federal measures. And there's a subsidy for mortgages provided so that people can buy housing. That's a federal program. And concluding on that question, and I'll try to be a bit faster, but coming to the issue of support to children with disabilities and their families. Talking about numbers, 1st of April 2025, the number of persons with disabilities was over 700,000, and that's 2.3% of the child population. And for these, we have a large range of guarantees to ensure they're protected and they have various opportunities. The Constitution and federal laws provide for this. They have the right to education. They have the same right to preschool, school, professional education. My colleague mentioned yesterday the special quota in higher education for persons with disabilities. There are also adaptation measures in all programs, and there are specialized workers to support them. In addition, there are individual educational programs because each educational institution, as my colleague can confirm, develops special conditions. There can be assistants and tutors and special equipment for children with disabilities, medical assistance, rehabilitation. They get free medical care for everything, rehabilitation measures. Their families receive a monthly payment because the child has disabilities, and there are benefits such as free medical care, sanatoria, and transport vehicles. Furthermore, they're entitled to free technical rehabilitation aids if that's provided for under their rehabilitation program. That's also supported by the state. That, I believe, is all that I have on that. And I want to say a couple of words about social support to older persons. The goal here, as regards what the state has to do for older persons, it's a large task. We have a strategy for older persons to 2030. Yesterday, that was mentioned to some degree. This year, the number of persons in that older persons category, 63 upwards for men, 58 upwards for women. It was 35 million people, 24% of our population. Now, there's a federal project for older persons within the National Demographic Project. It has the main provisions, including financial support. We have target indicators to increase longevity to 78. And within the whole of the country, we have standards for accessibility of medical assistance to older persons. We have a system for long-term spending for older persons, and In the 85 constituent parts of the Russian Federation, we have measures to support older persons, in particular. From 2020 to 2024, if the speaker could please slow down, we have. Thank you. These are specific. That's a specific example that confirms. And in conclusion, as regards the accessible environment, because a barrier-free environment is needed for persons with disability and older persons. On the basis of 2024, the number of priority objects that were accessible was over 41,500, which was 78% of the total number of objects. And all of our digital services are now adapted for older persons, for visually impaired persons, and for deaf persons. And that can be verified.
Respuestas muy específicas que nos ha proporcionado la delegación rusa.
Спасибо. Уважаемые дамы и господа, я отвечу.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ministry of Health, I'd like to answer questions related to the Article 12, medical services in rural areas, Arctic areas for small indigenous peoples, and the reunited subjects of the Russian Federation. The Constitution of the Russian Federation enshrines the right to medical support and assistance, regardless of gender, race, age, nationality, language, presence of any illnesses, condition, origin, social status, place of living, religion, convictions, participation in public association, and any other conditions, and guarantee citizens the protection against any forms of discrimination on the grounds of disease or illness. Everyone has the right to receive medical assistance at guaranteed levels without any payments, in line with the state program of state guarantees for free of charge medical assistance. This means that regardless of where the individual lives or the characteristics of that area, all citizens have guaranteed medical health protection and assistance. And this also covers the territories that have been reunited with the Russian Federation. Also, persons recognized as refugees have the right to receive medical assistance, just like Russian citizens, in line with legislation. On questions related to vaccinations, the question of prevention of infections are of strategic importance for the Russian Federation. The strategy for development of prevention of infectious diseases has been adopted for a period until 2035. In addition, there's a separate federal law on the prevention of infectious diseases. I'd like to now enumerate some of the principles enshrined in the strategy. First, immunization during the entire life cycle at any age. This is a standard norm for providing medical assistance, ensuring healthy and lengthy lives. Second, created conditions for equal access of population to existing vaccines. 3, development of an information system for citizens. In addition, to ensure that all citizens understand and support vaccinations. We have a national calendar for vaccinations, and citizens receive vaccinations, or 12 guarantees, including hepatitis, diphtheria, poliomyelitis, hemophilic infections, measles, epidemic parotid, fever, and tuberculosis, amongst others. Vaccinations based on epidemic indicators is carried out for groups at risks against 24 brucellosis, which means anthrax, rage, leptospirosis, encephalitis, Q fever, yellow fever, cholera, typhus, hepatitis A, shigellosis, meningitis infections, hepatitis B, diphtheria, hemophilic infections, COVID, and others. These vaccinations are provided to people living in endemic territories, people working in special professions, or in particular circumstances. Ensuring equal access of women and children to reproductive health. Russia has adopted a national strategy in support of women, and one of the objectives is ensuring women's health at all ages. The protection of reproductive health includes steps aimed at preserving reproductive health of the population, including adolescents, work with abortions, ensuring the formation of a responsible attitude to health, and improving the quality and access for medical assistance of the population. A set of measures being adopted in order to ensure knowledge amongst the women and children, the different questions related to health at all levels of education, starting with school education all the way to higher education, and also at the workplace. Access to gynecological services for women and families that wish to have children is supported by a widely developed network of medical organizations that are located as close as possible to areas where people live, including in faraway areas with low levels of the population. And medical support to women is given to women in more than 32,000 medical centers, including 2,500 mobile units. In addition, work is organized for 1,500 mobile teams with relevant medical specialists. Also, there is a system of guarantees where there's special offices that provide medical assistance where pregnant women can receive legal, psychological, and medical social assistance that women require, women that are in a situation of reproductive choice. As a result of these measures, the number of abortions in Russia has seen a steady trend towards reduction. And over the last year, this drop was 6.5%. Also, special attention is given to prevention activities as part of the federal project development of children's health. A whole set of measures is related to carrying out tests, medical tests of children from the age of 10 to 15, and that improving reproductive health with a view of early identification of any existing pathologies, any complications related to reproductive health through timely preventive and rehabilitation steps. In 2024, coverage was, and I'm talking about such preventive medical tests, they covered about 100%, practically 100% of the population. Starting in 2024, another measure has been implemented related to medical tests related to the assessment of reproductive health. And I'd like to say that all of such medical assistance is provided free of charge. And this helped us renew the historically low levels of child mortality that was 4 per million in 2024. And over the last 10 years, there was a twofold reduction in child mortality. in terms of providing medical assistance and preventive measures related to HIV. In the Russian Federation, there is a state strategy to prevent the spread of HIV infections until 2030. The objective of the strategy is to ensure a steady reduction of new cases of HIV infections in the population, reduction of deaths related to illnesses as a result of HIV. Main objectives are raising awareness of the population about HIV infections, and also creation of a social environment that removes any stigmatization or discrimination against HIV-infected persons. Ensuring a comprehensive interdisciplinary approach to diagnostics in providing medical assistance and social assistance to people with HIV, and also ensure broader coverage of therapies, and providing assistance to families and ensuring high quality of the living conditions for children with HIV infections. Russia has implemented an unprecedented program of the access of population to antiretroviral therapies, and coverage in 2024 was 90%. The number of persons that have been tested for HIV has grown. In 2024 was more than 54 million individuals. The number of new HIV infections is going down year after year, and in 2024 the drop was 11%. In other words, 50,000 new cases. This means that HIV numbers are reducing, reflecting the fact that the measures are effective. Now, providing medical assistance to drug users, especially a question related to measures related to harm reduction. As I said earlier, the Constitution and the federal legislation of the Russian Federation enshrines the rights of all citizens to receive free of charge medical assistance, regardless of their situation. Also, federal legislation states that state on an equal footing provides guarantees to all drug users support and social rehabilitation. The strategy anti-drug policy until 2030 provides for the banning on any other forms of replacement therapies to prevent drug consumption, and prevention of any unacceptable use of drug analgesics. Now, replacement therapy can be described as a form of palliative therapy, the objective of which is not curing the disease, but simply reducing the pain of the individual. So the approach is based on the fact that drug problems cannot be cured. That is simply unacceptable, and something that is confirmed by recent scientific research. And the effectiveness of such approaches has not been proved, but the negative medical social impact surpasses any possible positive results that have been seen amongst patients belonging to this group. Combating dependency on drug consumption is based on full and complete abstention from consuming drugs. And during treatment, the approach is based on individual treatment of each patient with the careful selection of means of recovery. In order to ensure diagnostics of drug abuse and medical treatment, methods are applied that are not banned by Russian legislation, and also medicines and medical tools that have been registered according to the law. methadone, that is one of the medicines that are used during replacement therapy, is removed from the list of drugs that are banned in the Russian Federation. That is fully in line with the Unified Convention on Narcotic Drugs from 1961. A comprehensive approach is related to detoxification therapy and combating withdrawal syndromes, therapy related to residual conditions, and also medical and social rehabilitation. The trends related to drug-related diseases reaffirms the correct approach used by the Russian Federation. And over the last 10 years, the overall numbers related to illnesses based on drug abuse has dropped 1.7 times, and the indicators of primary diseases has been reduced even more, 2.5 times. Now, on the system for the protection of the rights of patients. This system includes several levels for quality control on the safety of medical support. Legislation provides from state-level controls, agency-level controls, internal controls, and also independent assessment of the quality for provision of medical services by medical institutions, and also control of the volume, quality, and conditions for provisions of medical assistance as part of mandatory medical insurance. There's a special expertise related to quality of medical support, identifying any abuses, also assessment of the timeliness of provision of such assistance, the assessment whether the approaches selected were correct, diagnostics related to rehabilitation, and also the time for attainment of results. As a result of such inspections, medical organizations can be subject to sanctions, for example, non-payment or incomplete payment of medical assistance, penalties for not providing medical assistance or providing medical assistance of quality that is below standards. And all of this, the imposing of sanctions does not remove the obligation of the medical organization to provide to the patient any compensation related to the harm to the health of the individual, something that is regulated by the Civil Code of the Russian Federation and is carried out either through courts or through out-of-court settlements. Any harm to the health and lives of patients doesn't free medical health workers from their responsibility under Russian legislation. Thank you. A very brief comment from a colleague from the Ministry of Interior, very brief. Now, on combating illegal drug trafficking in Russia. In Russia, there is a national strategy until 2030 to combat drug trafficking, and the objective is reduction of illegal circulation of drugs, access to drugs, the reduction of the consequences of illegal consumption of drug, and the formation of environment of unacceptance of drug consumptions. And we give special attention to preventing drug crimes, large-scale drug crimes. More than 300 tons of banned substances have been removed from circulation. More than 500,000 crimes were identified, and more than 3,000 individuals were convicted. And these measures make it possible to reduce the involvement of the population in drug crimes, and we have reduced the number of persons committing drug-related crimes by 25% and 36% reduction in the number of people involved in such crimes. And starting in 2022, there's a twofold increase in the investigation of drug crimes committed in organized manner, and we have stopped the activities of 76 organized crime groups and closed. More than 4,000 drug laboratories were closed. And taking into account that criminal circles are moving into the digital sphere, the Ministry of Interior is carrying out work in blocking internet websites, and access to more than 400,000 of such sources was blocked. And the European Court on Human Rights has supported the steps taken by the Russian Federation that in November 2012 took a decision in favor of the Russian Federation that recognizes the fact that there were no human rights violations or discrimination against drug users. Thank you.
Можем продолжить. Ответы у нас еще есть.
We can continue with our replies. We can continue if you prefer that.
Или время?
Or is it time now?
Да, 5.
5 minutes? Okay. Please.
Хорошо, тогда Сергей Николаевич, просьба и...
Агентство по делам национальности я хотел бы...
Agency on Nationalities, I'd like to draw attention to the special features of medical support for vulnerable groups, indigenous peoples, representing 1/3 of the population of the country, something that is very important. It is clear that due to their ways of life and in areas where they live, some of the mechanisms may not be available. And taking into account their vulnerable situations, their pension age is 5 years lower than the rest of the population. Now, for nomadic populations, special medical tests are provided, and for that, we need to use large trucks or even ships in order to provide such assistance for these persons living in faraway areas. And of course, a lot depends on financial resources. And we're using medical aviation for nomadic groups. Also, we're providing funding for the purchases of medical kits to deal with medical diseases in Siberia, where the density of the population is very low. And of course, one of the problems is related to the violation of their traditional food chains, and federal law provides a whole set of measures ensuring priority access to natural resources. And of course, here we also have quite a few problems, financial problems, normative mechanisms, but it is a priority of our authorities to deal with those problems. Now I give the floor to my colleague from the Ministry of the Economy related to questions related to climate. Thank you very much. Ministry of Economy. Yesterday we heard several questions related to climate, and I'd like to summarize the information. Russia has carried out systematic work on climate and environment in 2018-2024. A national environmental project was implemented, and we have eliminated illegal dump sites. Waste processing centers were created, and we increased the size of protected areas with a special focus on water. We have rehabilitated 1.3 thousand hectares of water sites, and we've improved more than 27,000 hectares of water basins that helped improve the quality of life of more than 21 million people. As a federal project on the protection of unique water basins, financed with a sum of more than 13 billion rubles. And also there's a special program, Water in Russia, and starting 2019, more than 130,000 different events took place involving volunteers. And in 2025, we're launching a new project, environmental well-being, and the objective is to reduce emissions in 29 big cities and reduce by 20% such emissions, and ensure full transparency of environmental monitoring by citizens, including 100% access. A special program related to rehabilitation of forest as natural sinks for consumption of greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you, Your Excellency, and thank you for being so mindful about the time. Really appreciate that. The floor is now open for follow-up questions. I would request committee colleagues to kindly indicate those who wish to take the floor. Ms. Lee, yes, Ms. Lee, Mr. Hannibal. I see Ms. Lee, Ms. Hannibal, and Ms. Laura Elisa Perez. So Ms. Lee, Mr. Hannibal, and then Ms. Laura, and Mr. Giuseppe Pisano.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to ask a question on climate change adaptation. State party faces rising climate risks such as permafrost thaw, wildfires, floods, and Arctic coastal erosion, which disproportionately affect low-income households, indigenous peoples, and residents of remote northern regions. In this regard, I would like to ask a few questions. So State Party has a National Action Plan on Adaptation for the second phase of until 2025, as is stated in paragraph 9 of its reply. Is the State Party updating its action plan for next phase? How will the State Party ensure that the updated National Adaptation Plan identifies vulnerable groups and include measurable indicators disaggregated by region, sex, age, ethnicity, and economic status? What measures are in place to ensure the effective participation of indigenous peoples and local communities in climate risk assessments and adaptation planning? What steps has the State Party taken to protect housing and infrastructure in permafrost and coastal zones, health during wildfire smoke events, and livelihoods and cultural life from climate risks? What measures has the State Party taken to strengthen regional capacity and financing to close protection gaps between regions? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Mr. Hannibal, you have the floor, sir.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci également à la
Thank you, Chair, and I thank the delegation for this dialogue and exchange of views. I'd like to come back to one point in order to take it into account as we continue our exchanges. And I recall that the rights guaranteed by the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights continue to apply without any derogation during periods of conflicts, including during prolonged military occupation. So the State Party is obliged to respect and implement the entire set of rights enshrined in the Covenant, and persons under its jurisdiction or under effective control in line with principles of international law. And this is an obligation that also covers the territories of Ukraine occupied militarily, where the Russian Federation exercises a minimum of administrative, institutional, and security control that is direct. So the obligations under the Covenant will be applied extraterritorially, where the state has control over territorial populations, and this is separate from the question of sovereignty. These obligations are not suspended in times of war and not replaced by military law, and all of this has to coexist. Now, the respect of the Covenant in the context is not subordinate to any geopolitical considerations. This is an international legal obligation that is binding based on the sovereign decision of the State Party when it acceded to the Covenant. We see as part of this dialogue, despite the repeated demands for clarification related certain reports, allegations from different sources, the State Party has not provided any substantial, legally founded replies related to these allegations. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that in absence of substantive replies on these issues, the committee will be obliged to potentially consider that such obligations may be presumed true Nevertheless, or in any case, the committee is concerned by a whole series of allegations by the widespread violations of economic, social, and cultural rights in occupied territories and in the territory of the Russian Federation. I'd like to say here that the issues that were mentioned here that I believe should be dealt with in a more substantive manner related to allegations of indiscriminate or deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure, schools, hospitals, electricity facilities, under several articles of the covenant, the forced transfer of children, something that you referred to. It's still part of the questions that we have and concerns that we have, the imposed re-education, imposition of the language, something that runs counter the provisions of the covenant and international law and can be assimilated to, can be equal to forced assimilation. There were also allegations that high-level officials of the state party, including the presidential commissioner on children that should protect children, and that the head of state, the president, may be involved in war crimes and the illegal transfer of children from temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine to Russia. And these allegations are subject of international arrest warrant of the ICC, and this strengthens obviously the concerns of the committee. We know about this information, and this is why it is important for us to have an exchange of views on these questions and also have some additional information on all of this. Another question relates to the use of coercion to force civilian workers to continue working and under the occupation administration, and also the risks related to nuclear energy, the situation in penitentiary services, or the blocking political conditions and access to social rights where their obtention is dependent on obtaining a Russian passport. Something that will also violate certain articles of the covenant, suppressing Ukrainian language, rewriting of history, closure of schools, the persecution of teachers and other educational workers. All of this are allegations that were brought to our knowledge, and we would like to share them with you as part of this constructive dialogue to once again give you the possibility to clarify the situation, to understand how you understand such situations. Other structural violations have also been alleged, especially in connection to what is happening inside the Russian Federation, the systemic discrimination of ethnic minorities. We'll come back to that. And now I would like to stress the possibility to continue to have our dialogue on issues that may be difficult. One, this is very serious issues, difficult issues, but this is why we're here to review the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hannibal. I have 3 more requests for the floor, but I would request our colleagues to kindly be mindful of the time. Ms. Perez, and then after that, Mr. Palmisano, and then Mr. Winford. Ms. Perez, you have the floor, ma'am.
Muy buenos
Good morning.
respuestas muy específicas que nos ha proporcionado la delegación rusa.
Very specific replies to cluster 3, and I have 6 requests for clarification. First, what is Russia doing against so-called honor crimes, forced marriages, and community reprisals in specific areas? And second question, inquiries into the use of time. What is the state party doing about distribution of unremunerated domestic work? And third question, we've received information regarding forced evictions of Ukrainian families whose properties are then declared abandoned. What legal measures are available within Russia to avoid this issue? 4. And I welcome the information provided on health. I would like to receive information on investment in health in terms of GDP. And I'd like to know whether the relevant healthcare indicators are periodically published throughout the country. 5. On reports that we've received of female genital mutilation. This is a serious violation of women's rights. It appears to be occurring in the Northern Caucasus. What is the state party taking to stop it and punish perpetrators? And 6, through international information, we know about a considerable gap in longevity between men and women. Is the Russian Federation taking measures to overcome this significant issue? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Pambisano, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have 2 very short questions. The first one is about protection of children. The number of children with disabilities who are institutionalized in the Russian Federation is very high. Could you please inform the committee whether policies or measures are going to be implemented to reduce institutionalization of children with disabilities, a practice that is not in compliance with Article 10, paragraph 3 of the Covenant, but also is not in compliance with the UN CRPD and the Convention on the Right of the Child. And my second question concerns the obligation to protect health under Article 12. As we know, this obligation covers everyone, including detained persons and political prisoners. Could you please inform the committee about how and to what extent the right to health protection for detained persons and political prisoners is effectively guaranteed throughout the Russian Federation, including Crimea? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Winford, and requested kindly to be brief as well, sir.
The last are bit by the dog. Yeah. No, I tried to be short. I would like to come back first to the colleague on the questions of indigenous people. According to the information I have at least read, this voluntary register you were talking about for indigenous persons is not really so voluntary. It's apparently very difficult to become part of it, and in some parts it's restricting the economic activities of these people. So I would like to ask you, what do you observe maybe as obstacles? Yeah, the same as with the territories of traditional resource use. You were saying they are there to protect indigenous peoples, but many of them are not operational yet. Yeah, so how many of them are operational? How do you want to make them operational? That's very important. I also read that access to fishing rights is not always easy with the register. It has become more problematic. That's the questions I have to that. Concerning the social payments for elderly people, I have the question, if you have an old and an aging population and you were referring what you are paying, so what is your prospect on maybe the social payments you have to do in future and how this will relate to your budget? In that relationship, it's a problem not only the Russian Federation, as many aging societies have. So I'm interested in this. The questions on climate adaptation has already been raised. Maybe at the end, just one personal question. While you talk about what you do on children's rights and the right to health, you are bombing at the same time also in the Ukraine hospitals and kindergartens. So that is also a strong contradiction in your attempt to implement these economic, social, cultural rights. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Your Excellency. Now, you've been asked a lot of questions. I don't know whether you'll have the time to respond to all of them. because we're running out of time, but 20 minutes is what. But you've been very disciplined, sir, so please, you have the floor.
Спасибо.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To start with answers to two questions. First, on adaptation to climate change and updating of the plan. What I should say is the successor to the National Ecology Project from January 2025 has been the National Ecological Wellbeing Project 2030. So we have a plan of action to 2030, and within it, there's a focus in particular on reducing emissions of dangerous and polluting substances through a series of measures developed individually for each participating system for the pilot project on quotas. And if we look at figures, the main indicator of the national project to 2030 is reducing overall emissions of dangerous and polluting substances in 9 cities by 20%. And providing accessible public information on the main areas of environmental monitoring. That's 100%. So we are focusing in particular on ensuring that our public has full information on the environmental conditions and the monitoring. Within the project, and following on from the previous project, we also have a series, a separate section of measures to train the staff, including in regions such as Donetsk and Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia. And in conclusion, what I should say is that we have adopted in 2023 a state program on restoration of socioeconomic development in Donetsk and Luhansk, in Zaporizhia and Kherson, within which there is renewal of housing, upgrading of transport infrastructure, development of the social sphere, creation of a favorable environment, and the reunited regions are expected to meet the mean Russian indicators for prosperity, with an increase in business activity and direct state support through subsidies from the federal budget. As regards climate change, specifically in global warming, from Russia's point of view, there are some positive trends, including the fact that many far north regions are increasing their vegetation period for agriculture, and shipping in the Northern Sea route has a longer season. So our state has a set of measures to adapt to climate change, and there are long-term and mid-term plans for its implementation. On a program close to my heart, because I'm responsible for the social fund, and there were questions from Mr. Winfer on that, on payments to older persons. Now, within Russia, coverage by pensions is 100%. In other words, every person among pensioners, pensionable age, has the right to a pension, even if they haven't worked. They still have the right to a social pension. They get it 5 years later than everybody else, but they do get it, and that's important. Many other countries don't do that, but Russia ensures that the pension can be paid at the same time as work. So a pensioner can be working and still get their pension, and it's indexed. If a pensioner also has disabilities, then they also get the monthly disability benefit. And the more severe the disability category, we have three categories. where category 3 gets the highest payment, on the basis of the budget parameters for the social fund. Russia's budget being based on the federal and the social fund budgets, which are separate. The social fund budget for the 3-year planning cycles, and that applies to both types of budget, but we have sufficient resources through insurance payments to cover all of the obligations that arise towards older persons. So they're guaranteed. This is a public document, the budget for the social fund and the federal budget, and all of the necessary transfers to cover other social spending. And there are over 140 types, in addition to pensions, which come from insurance. They come from the federal budget, and the resources are provided and indexed at a level that is no lower than inflation. So we, via the federal legislation, ensure that all social obligations towards older persons are complied with. Another comment now. We, for some years, have been developing a system for long-term care, which covers free assistance to persons, older persons and persons with disabilities who need ongoing care from third parties. So we ensure that that care is provided in terms of hours. It is free for the recipient. It's not insurance-based. It's social care. So first of all, we try to train relatives in care, and we provide the resources to the older person or the person with disabilities to ensure that the relatives who were previously providing care just because they were relatives, they can now receive a payment for doing that. So these are some of the measures that we are implementing. And a reply now regarding the question on implementation of the covenant and in particular in the reunited regions, which from Russia's point of view are, and I want to emphasize this again, these are regions that rejoined the Russian Federation under our constitution. They are regions of the Russian Federation. And within those regions, such as Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, we are implementing the legislation of the Russian Federation fully, both in terms of pension payments, in terms of social care, ensuring the rights of entrepreneurs, anybody else involved in business. All of the legal regimes that exist in other parts of Russia exist there. On children, and we, as I have said, under international humanitarian law, we had to evacuate them from the zones of armed conflict. And my education ministry colleague, Andrei, gave a clear answer on the mechanisms for the evacuation. And this, I believe, was a comprehensive reply. This is done under international humanitarian law and in compliance with the covenant, which we are discussing today. I would also like to make a comment in response to Mr. Hannibal, who asked about what I would call forced labor in certain sites. What I will say is this: in Russia, forced labor is prohibited, and there are articles of criminal law on that. In Russia, forcing labor is not possible. There's not a single employer who will do that, because first of all, they would face criminal responsibility. So no employer is going to employ anybody who is being forced to do that work. We have a full system of measures, including in the newly reunited regions. We have labour inspections. We have the Office of the Prosecutor General, the Interior Ministry in those regions represented. And if we had a single case where somebody in Russia, including in the nuclear facility that has been mentioned, if there was forced labour, then we would be ready to investigate that and give comprehensive replies. But as we see it, that is simply not possible because, I'll say it again, in the Russian Federation, forced labour is prohibited. And there's not a single employer who would take that risk because it's a crime. And with that, I thank you, and I want to give the floor to my colleagues. Sergei Nikolaevich would like to reply on the indigenous peoples. Yes, we had questions on the indigenous peoples, and I would like to thank the distinguished members for their interest in this important issue. And I want to give clear replies on the indigenous peoples of the North and the register. As a person who participated in developing the register, difficulties in terms of administrative or legal obstacles to entering the register do not exist because the register is voluntary, and the procedures which would require verification of information and refusal of admission to the register because of not meeting certain requirements, apart from the single requirement. If it was simply incomplete documentation, that's not an issue, because it doesn't matter whether a person provides information on whether they're carrying out traditional activities. The person has to reply yes or no, but we're not allowed to go and check. And that opens up a series of rights. So there could be some procedural complexities. The register, when it was adopted, we had to enter about 300,000 people over just a few years, and that was quite difficult for our agency. So there could be some technical difficulties, but in terms of making an application, there's a multifunctional center in each region to address that. It was a complex task. There was a number of agreements that had to be concluded, but following that, we managed to speed things up considerably. There are still some technical issues, but they're not systematic. On the effectiveness of the legal regimes for traditional land use, for example, in Russia, we recognize some 9 million square kilometers as traditional lands in Russia, and 2 million of those are traditional nature use. That's a stricter legal regime which limits the possibilities for industry. So 9 million square kilometers, that's more than the whole of Western and Eastern Europe together. And there's not a single country in the world that has had to face that type of task, providing legal regimes and monitoring for such a landmass. Of course, there are some complexities there because of the broadness of the rights of the indigenous peoples. We have a region where half of Russian oil is extracted, and a quarter of that region is in the strictest category of protection. There's not a single facility, oil or gas, that can be sited there without signatures from every affected family. So we do have these models. There are a lot of models for covering the land use of the traditional lands. And when there's this broad legal recognition of rights, then the financial and other mechanisms can be complex. But and looking at the scope, the size of the indigenous lands, this can explain some gaps in our work. Now, as regards fishing, traditional fishing, unlike many states, we recognize traditional hunting and fishing by the indigenous peoples as a separate category of nature use, which gets legal priority. In terms of access to certain categories, there can be complexities because they're particularly valuable, threatened species of fish. And there can be some restrictions on the access by the indigenous peoples to those for that reason. So that can, of course, give rise to concerns. It's a complex matter. But in terms of constitutional monitoring, this takes place. And in recent years, there have been Constitutional Court and Supreme Court rulings that have broadened the interpretation of the rights of the indigenous peoples and requiring reform of the legislation to remove some administrative barriers. There have been a number of laws on traditional fishing, including a few months ago, a law was adopted. And there doesn't have to be a declaration regarding bioresources. So the legislation has been reformed under the constitutional monitoring process. One of the indicators is the share of the limits on bioresources, and up to 30% of the bioresources in Russia are now allocated to the indigenous peoples, to their communities and to individuals. Some can meet difficulties in getting access to specific valuable species, but this is a difficulty that faces everybody. Thank you. A brief comment. Ms. Perez asked about home care for children, as I understand. No. A few things I should say here. A woman gets pregnant and she gets maternity leave 70 days before the birth and 70 days after, covered entirely in terms of her salary. She gets her full salary. Now the child's born, the woman has been working. There's social insurance which covers that. It covers the loss of income and the maternity up to 1.5 years of age. The social fund will be paying the mother compensation for the average income. The labour legislation also has a provision to the effect that the mother, or either parent, in fact, can look after the child to the age of 3. So from 18 months to 3 years, there's no payment, but the parent gets the right to keep their job. So up to 18 months, I reiterate, either of the parents can be looking after the child, they can be working and they can be getting the benefit, even if they haven't lost their income. This is the way that we apply our know-how to encourage childbirth. So that's my comment. And if further information is required, I'm prepared to give it. Now, is there any further information from the delegation?
Коллега из Минздрава.
Health Ministry. Kazimir is going to talk about healthcare spending. In recent years, In terms of GDP percentages, spending on healthcare overall has been about 3.5%. Thank you. And since I've already replied on children with disabilities in cluster 1, we can give written information which will confirm that children with disabilities, even I would say, get priority in terms of social support. And the institutions created, there are over 110 social organizations created for persons with different types of disabilities, and providing all possible measures to ensure that these children are well cared for. But that's only if the parents have wished to place the child voluntarily in the institution. It has to be voluntary. If we can have another minute, we can say about women as well.
Спасибо.
Thank you. There was a question about FGM. The health ministry in recent years has not, in international fora, has spoken out against international fora many times in recent years. We stand with the international community against FGM and harmful traditional practices, including in some regions of the North Caucasus, yes, which you mentioned. We wish to emphasize that the practice is illegal and it's not in the list of medical services that can be provided. So we don't have official data on the number of procedures. Furthermore, the legislation on health protection and on patients where the harm to their healthcare appears to result from illegal activity, a report is required in that case to the Interior Ministry. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to your colleagues as well for a comprehensive response to the questions raised. May I now request Mr. Ashraf Kanhai to kindly raise his questions under cluster 4 of the covenant. Thank you. You have the floor, sir.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I join the Chair and the other members of the task force in extending a very warm welcome to the head, the distinguished head and members of the delegation. We shall now address the issues arising from Articles 13, 14, and 15, which deal essentially with the rights to education and cultural rights. We have considered with great interest the information which you have provided in the replies to the list of issues, and in which you have referred to a number of policies and legislative measures which have been taken with the aim of improving access to education, in particular for the marginalized and disadvantaged groups of the population. So will you please provide information supported by disaggregated statistical data on the progress achieved on the literacy rates, as well as the school enrollment, attendance, and completion rates at all levels by 1, children from Roma families, 2, children from the numerically small indigenous peoples, and 3, children from ethnic and religious minorities. What are the measures in place to address the significant decline in enrollment and completion rates at both secondary and higher education level in rural and remote areas, in the occupied territories, and amongst the marginalized and disadvantaged segments of the population, including Roma children, the indigenous peoples, and ethnic minorities? Please provide information as to the legal and institutional safeguards to protect LGBTQI children and children from disadvantaged and marginalized backgrounds from being subjected to any harassment, stigmatization, or discrimination in the school environment. Now, available statistical figures indicate that the education system excludes children with disabilities from mainstream education, and these children are still being placed mostly in segregated institutions. Please provide information on measures taken to put an end to the institutionalization of children with disabilities and to ensure that they have access to fully inclusive education in all schools and regions. And what are the steps taken to ensure that asylum seekers and stateless children and children of foreign nationals are not denied access to schools on grounds of administrative constraints and such documentary constraints as proof of registration of their place of residence, and also as a result of their lack of knowledge of the Russian language. Another issue of major concern is in respect of the militarization of education of the Ukrainian children in occupied territories. This is reportedly due to the educational programs and policies which promote military training, war propaganda, and enlistment of these children in the military service. It is also reported that the Russian state curriculum has been imposed in place of the Ukrainian curriculum, such that Ukrainian language and textbooks have been removed from schools, and there is no access to Ukrainian online education. The Russian textbooks and learning programs which have been introduced focus on glorification of war, militarization of children, and eradication of their Ukrainian identity. What steps are being taken to address the militarization of education, the standardization of historical narratives, and the erasure of cultural accounts and heritage? What are the safeguards in place against the imposition of militarized contents in the school curriculum? And what is being done to ensure that the school curricula in the occupied territories do not serve as preparation for military enlistment or any form of indoctrination contrary to Articles 13 and 15 of the Covenant? And please also tell us what is being done to ensure that Ukrainian children in the occupied territories have free access to Ukrainian online education programs without harassment or fear of any reprisals. And what are the steps taken as an occupying power to ensure that the rights of the Ukrainians in the occupied territories to access education and to take part in cultural life as enshrined in the Covenant are effectively guaranteed, and there is no form of ethnic, cultural, or linguistic predominance or hierarchization in place? What are the measures and safeguards to afford protection? One, from any damage to or destruction of educational infrastructure, cultural sites, or monuments, and two, from the expropriation of artifacts and objects forming part of the Ukrainian cultural heritage in the occupied territories. Please provide information as to the restitution, recognition, and reparation measures and the implementation of remedial action required in such cases. Please also provide information as to concrete measures in place to provide adapted curricula, textbooks, educational materials, as well as suitably qualified teachers, which are required in order to ensure that the teaching of children of the indigenous people, ethnic minorities, and Ukrainians in occupied territories is effectively carried out in their mother tongues. And what are the mechanisms in place to guarantee freedom of artistic expression, free from censorship or any other form of undue interference? And what are the measures in place to ensure that artists, including singers, musicians, authors, as well as scientists and other persons of creative expression, are protected from harassment and are not deprived of the financial proceeds obtained from their works for just being critical of the government? Now, next, regarding scientific research and technological progress, please tell us what are the safeguards in place to prevent the misuse of emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, surveillance, and biotechnology, for purposes which may be incompatible with the protection of human rights, privacy, and human dignity. Please provide information as to the legal and institutional measures in place in order to guarantee academic freedom and independence of scientific and academic research, including international academic cooperation, and to protect researchers and academics from reprisals or any form of ideological interference in respect of their work or publications. How is equitable access to the benefit of scientific progress guaranteed and implemented without discrimination, including in particular for people living in rural and remote areas, indigenous people, or persons living in conflict-afflicted regions? And finally, what are the concrete measures taken to ensure affordable access to the internet for all the vulnerable and advantaged groups living in particular in rural and remote areas? I thank you for your attention, and we look forward to your replies in order to pursue our fruitful and constructive dialogue.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Mr. Kanhai. And may I request distinguished delegation to kindly respond to the questions on cluster 4. You have the floor, sir.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. First, to start our answers, be the Deputy Minister of Education. Distinguished Chair, distinguished experts, I'm sincerely thankful for the questions that were just raised in connection with education and access to education. I'll start by saying that the Constitution of the Russian Federation enshrines free of charge, accessible general education. In the Russian Federation, there is a system that guarantees and we in fact have reached 100% coverage in terms of education access to preschool education facilities, primary general and secondary general education levels. In terms of increasing literacy, Russian Federation is party to the relevant expert procedures, for example, visa teams, and also there's a national system for assessing the quality of education. And on the basis of those indicators, Russia occupies one of the leading spots amongst countries. I'd also like to say that pupils from the Russian Federation almost always win competitions in international Olympiads on humanitarian disciplines and also in humanities and scientific subjects. Access to education. The structure of educational institutions in the Russian Federation is developed in such a way as to ensure that all citizens, including in rural areas, faraway territories with difficult access, to ensure that children from these areas have access to education. For example, in rural areas, small-scale schools are created and available in areas with difficult access that are far away. With indigenous peoples, we organize so-called nomad schools, and there are relevant specialized programs for training educators in such organizations, and support measures are also available. On questions of school enrollment and schooling for Roma children, we have seen a trend and relevant measures were taken And we see that from statistics that the number of Roma children in general schools is increasing. For example, we see that in 2023-2024, children from Roma families studying in schools numbered about 50,000. And this year, the number was 51,000. Appropriate measures, including early measures, are taken in order to encourage parents from Roma families to ensure that they enroll their children in educational institutions. Now, I'd like to turn to the question of children with disabilities in the Russian Federation. For a period of the last 15 years, approximately, the principle of inclusive education is applied. The selection of different educational programs and the adaptation of such programs is done in light of the physiological capabilities of the child, and this is done in line with the decisions taken by the relevant pedagogical medical commission that determines what additional special assistance is required for the child to ensure that the child receives quality education and is able to study. This includes the provision of a tutor or an assistant, someone who is present in class next to the child and helps the child in the process of learning. Now, if for some particular reasons it is impossible to ensure the education of the child on the basis of the principle of inclusion in general schools, in Russia there's a whole set of correctional educational institutions where children with particular physiological difficulties study. Also, there is a system of what we call medical schools, where children that are in very difficult health situations and simply physically are unable to go to schools. And in those cases, then educators are carrying out educational activities in relevant medical organizations. And also there's an opportunity for parents to choose education at home. This is all covered by the relevant law, and there are different options, comprehensive options to ensure education with for children with limited capabilities and with children with disabilities, to ensure school education, access to education for foreign nationals and refugees. The federal law on education clearly states that foreign nationals enjoy the same rights to education just like the citizens of the Russian Federation. There are no limitations or restrictions related to registration at the place of the household. No such restrictions exist. Yes, of course, there's a priority that is given school enrollment, for children that live close to the educational institution. Priority is given to those children, but always there is a possibility. There are openings in schools where children that are not living in the vicinity of the school can be enrolled, those who are there on a temporary basis. Also, you notice that amendments were adopted to the federal law that provide for foreign nationals have to pass a test during school enrollment, a test related to the knowledge of Russian. And the purpose of having such a law, in fact, there are two objectives. First is to determine the level of knowledge of Russian and ensure that the foreign national has such an educational path that makes it possible to fully study and learn. For those foreign nationals that fail the test, they are offered preparatory courses to learn Russian in order to make it possible for this foreign national to learn the different educational programs and curricula. And the tests are adapted in such a manner that make it possible for a national with a minimal knowledge of Russian to pass the test. For example, in order to be enrolled in the first grade, the test includes certain requirements. For example, the future student is asked for his name, where he or she lives, and the child is shown a picture and asked to describe what is depicted there. So these are very simple tests that make it possible to enroll a child, a foreign national, into schools on the basis of such tests. About the militarization of education. The Russian Federation is a party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the protocol to the convention that prohibits the participation of children in armed conflicts. Children cannot be part of the military service and participate in armed conflicts. This is something that is prohibited. And I understand when you mention the militarization of education in the Russian Federation, there's some specialized schools, the Suvorov, Nahimov schools, schools for cadets, where in addition to the general educational curricula, children study the basics of military service. And I repeat, the basics. And this relates to descriptions of the system of military service in the Russian Federation, the principles of military service, and do not in any way and during this educational process, children do not participate in any military actions or armed conflicts. The study in these schools is voluntary, and after these studies, the child decides on its own whether to become part of the military law enforcement agency or be rather involved in humanities or choose another path. Access to education in the territories that were reunited with the Russian Federation. As I said yesterday, starting 1st September, in the territories of the Donetsk and Luhansk People Republic, in Zaporozhsk and Kherson Oblast, 2,656 educational organizations started their operations. 1,112 kindergartens and 1,108 schools. 160 are organizations of secondary vocational training. All of them started operating on the 1st of September. 92% are carrying out educational activities with children present in schools, and 8% are involved in online educational activities. Those who are going to these schools are in fact 421,000 children. 25,300 are children that have just started school for the first time, first grade students. The beginning of the school year was based on broad-scale work by the Russian Federation to prepare the school year, including, if necessary, the rehabilitation or full renovation of school educational buildings. More than 300 school facilities were renovated. Children studying in these schools enjoy the very same guarantees that exist in the territory of the Russian Federation: free of charge meals, Thank you very much. Andre, I give the floor to my colleagues from the Ministry of Education. Ministry of Science and Higher Education. Distinguished Chair, distinguished members of the committee, In the Russia Federation, what is guaranteed is free of charge higher education on the basis of competition. And the law on education specifies the number of mandatory spots that are extended, 800 places for 10,000 individuals the age between 17 and 30. In addition, every year, more such places are available above the planned levels. In 2025-2026 school years, 592,000 places based on the budgets, and a separate category involves the reunited subjects of the Russian Federation, 29,600. And the demands in the reunited territories were satisfied on the basis of their requests. Now, one of the main areas for the distribution of budget-based spots is focused on making them available in the regions of the Russian Federations. And 76% has been allocated to all the regions except Moscow, the Moscow region, and St. Petersburg and the region of St. Petersburg. We'll have to also point out that some quotas are also provided in addition to persons with disabilities, also orphans, and also have been left without parent guardianships. Also, this includes children with disabilities from birth, and also children and individuals who received wounds during military service, and all of them receive free of charge higher education. Now on the small numbered indigenous peoples, separate special attention is given to these groups of the population with providing educational place from the budget. Recent figures show that about 50,000 representatives of small numbered indigenous peoples were covered by these activities, and also special programs are available studying the culture, traditions of small numbered indigenous peoples. And these programs cover more than 300 individuals. I'd also like to point out that for persons studying at the higher level of education, there are separate social stipends or allowances. And for the most successful students in promoting programs in the study of traditions, culture of small numbered indigenous peoples, special higher allowances are provided. On persons with disabilities studied in higher level executions in 20 was more than 39,000. And more than 55% of these individuals find employment after these studies.
Dissemination of these studies. In science, we have freedom of scientific activity. That is the principle in the Russian Federation, and in line with our legislation, we have a choice of method in carrying out scientific experiments, and we also recognize the right to justified risk in academic activity, and freedom of access to academic and technical information, apart from certain cases connected with the state security. As regards restrictions on the use of AI, there are standards. They are stipulated on the basis of general legislation provisions, and there is responsibility in the case of unjustified use of AI, which brings harm. That brings civil responsibility. There's also responsibility for improper use of personal data in using AI. And there is also provision for criminal liability for certain criminal acts connected with dishonest use of data without the agreement of the involved person. So that is all I have on that. Thank you.
Коллегу, немножко дополнить.
I would like to add, if we speak about budgetary posts, then the federal budget finances training of these persons. So there's no payment for training that person. Whether the person is a person with disabilities or an indigenous person, that's a general concept. What we mean is that there's a free training place provided. And another comment on the issue of rural locations and healthcare and education provision there. Within the development of infrastructure to 2024, we have the topic of sustainable development of rural areas through the creation of comfortable living conditions. That's a strategic priority of Russia. And what's important in implementing that goal is digitalization above all within the rural economy and business. If we take the example of 2021, a lot was spent on telecommunications, about 2 trillion rubles. On specific indicators for provision of high-speed internet to schools in 2023, we were providing high-speed internet to 45,000 schools, of which half were in rural locations. So there's 100% provision, in fact. And that a large number of rural schools are within that context. So I want to give the floor also to the Culture Ministry, because there were some questions. Yes, Culture Ministry. In the cluster 4 questions, I have the following. In Russia, we guarantee cultural heritage for future generations, as established in the Constitution and federal laws. State protection of cultural objects within all of Russia is one of the priorities of the state authorities at all levels. In the regions, we have cultural heritage protection bodies, and the legislation covers all of the objects contained within the register, which enjoy state protection to prevent harm, destruction, and so forth. As regards objects within the reunited regions, these are also under state protection from the moment that the region rejoins the Russian Federation. On creativity, under a constitution, there is freedom for literary and other forms of creation. And throughout Russia, under the federal project on creative people, we take measures to develop support to theatre, music, circus and other arts. And state support to creative projects is carried out through the provision from the federal budget of subsidies or grants. Another effective instrument for support and development of creativity is competitions at various levels, international, regional, and more local. Equal access to culture and creativity is provided to children with disabilities, and I point to the work done in Russia to develop inclusive creativity labs, which involves children with disabilities and others with special needs in the creation of creative products.
Thank you, Your Excellency, and to your delegation for this very comprehensive response to questions raised under Cluster 4. Your Excellency, as you're aware, I've had the privilege of living in your country. That was some years back, and I've seen firsthand the quality of excellent education that is provided and the very gentle care with which children are treated in schools. And that is something that struck me most during my stay in Moscow. And of course, Russia continues to attract a lot of international students today. That also is an example of how exemplary your education system is. So thank you for the additional details provided. The floor is now open for follow-up questions. And I recognize Mr. Kanhai, followed by Mr. Lazari and Ms. Chen and Ms. Rossi. I see that. All right. So there's Ms. Lee as well. So Mr. Kanhai, as the cluster leader, please, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I must first of all express my deep appreciation for all the answers provided. And I still have a few questions, mainly in respect of certain issues which might require further clarification or which have not sufficiently been dealt with. The first one is with regard to safeguards for protecting LGBTQI children within the school environment. We have not been favored with any information concerning the measures that are in place, both legal, administrative and institutional, to protect children from disadvantaged or marginalized backgrounds, but including in particular LGBTQI children from any stigmatization or harassment or discrimination within the school environment. So we shall be grateful if we are favored with precise information on that issue. Then with regard to militarization of education, one of the main concerns is with regard to the school curriculum. And we shall be grateful if we could be provided with information in connection with the safeguards against the imposition of militarized contents in the curriculum, in what is being taught, and also what is being done to address the banning of Ukrainian language and the teaching in the schools, and whether any steps are being taken to provide adapted curriculum, educational materials, and teaching facilities in the mother tongues in the occupied territories, as well as for this problem also arises in respect of the indigenous people. But we are more concerned here in the first place with teaching in the Ukrainian schools in occupied territories. We also would like to be enlightened about what has been asked previously, what is being done to ensure that there is free access to Ukrainian online education programs without any harassment or fear of reprisals. And will you also please tell us about measures in place to afford effective protection against any form of censorship or undue interference with artistic freedom. We have had some information provided with research and scientific freedom, but with artistic freedom. One of the complaints has been that some artists and persons of creative expression have been deprived of their financial income or proceeds of their works, of their artistic works, just because they have spoken against the government. So will you please provide us information in that respect? And next, as regards extinction and eradication of native languages, we have dealt to a certain extent with that issue, but there are quite disturbing reports which show a trend towards the extinction of some native languages as a result of the policies in place. One of the consequences, for instance, has been that 15 languages have ceased to be used in everyday communication, and 8 native languages have no more any native speakers. And educational instruction in 38 languages have ceased completely. And native language teachers fell from 22,000 in 2009 to only 15,000 in 2023. So it would be helpful to know what is, if you can please tell us what is being done to reverse that trend and to ensure the preservation and prevent the extinction of indigenous and other linguistic heritage across the country. Then with regard to safeguards to prevent the use of emerging technologies, we are grateful for the information provided with respect to AI and protection of data, but we still would like to have some information on what are the safeguards, legal and institutional, in place with regard to the misuse of emerging technologies in respect of surveillance and unjustified use of biotechnology. So I thank you for your attention. We shall be grateful if we could have some additional answers with regard to these issues.
Thank you, Mr. Kanhai. Now give the floor to Ms. Shen, followed by Mr. Bouzid. Ms. Shen, you have.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. I also would like to thank Russian delegation for the answer in such a richful information. So thank you. Indeed, the report of replies introduced many projects in education, including effective measures taken corresponding, like adjustments made during the epidemic period. And in paragraph 173 of the replies, refers education program, different foreign language education has been set up for different groups or regions to meet different needs, including native languages of small indigenous peoples and Chinese in Far East region. I think it's quite good. So I would like to know that, or just please provide further information on the current situation or the subsequent progress. One more in paragraph report paragraph 196. It refers food aid increase year by year, including for school feeding systems implemented in some countries. So my question is that whether such food aid is continuing ongoing and the subsequence. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chen. Mr. Bouzid, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, according to the to paragraph 256 of the state report, it is stated that the Ministry of Science and Higher Education selects foreign students for training in Russian universities, applying a quota set by the federal government. I would like to know some details about this quota and on which criteria the ministry selects those foreign students and the number of students, foreign students studying in Russia, and maybe nationalities and so on, and especially from developing countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Rosie?
Thank you, Chair. Two questions on the cluster under clarification on the reply to the previous cluster. First, the right to participate in cultural life. Building on the question by the country rapporteur on the LGBTI plus community, what general and cultural measures are being taken to remove hate speech, prejudice, and other discrimination against that community, and measures to ensure participation in cultural life on an equal footing without discrimination? And if you could please clarify how things stand with healthcare for that community, because there was a question from the other cluster and I didn't hear an answer to it. Does healthcare cover gender affirmation? And coming back to the indigenous peoples now and cultural life, the delegation informed us about new legislation that requires the approval by the indigenous community for the development of exploitation hydrocarbon projects in the territories. And I would like to have details on how that process works, whether it respects the free, prior, informed consent principles as established in our covenant and international law generally, including social impact and environmental impact studies required for the consultations, and on restitution and reparation for indigenous communities. Do they exist for communities which have been, where there has been harm from extraction, or for example from Norilsk nickel, which harmed food, water and housing? And in the replies on drug policy in the previous cluster, I would like to ask, will the committee in 2017 made a number of recommendations, including decriminalizing possession for personal use. And there were other recommendations connected to the provision of harm reduction services. I listened to your replies, and my question is, how have these recommendations been taken into account, the 2017 recommendations of the committee by the state party? Were they taken into account? Were they set aside? And finally, and linked to that, certain community service organizations for harm reduction have been declared hostile organizations and prohibited. Could you please provide clarification on that? Because that is a concern for the committee, as does the prohibition on other human rights organizations within the territory of Russia in certain cases. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Rossi. I have on my list now Ms. Lee, followed by Mr. Winfo and Ms. Perez. Ms. Lee, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, distinguished members of the delegation. I have two questions. first, the committee is concerned by reports that Rostat, the Federal State Statistics Service, has increasingly limited the publication of socioeconomic data. So please clarify the reasons for the reduced publication of socioeconomic data by Rostat and explain what measures the state party is taking to ensure the availability, accessibility, and transparency of disaggregated statistical data necessary for monitoring economic, social, and cultural rights. Second question, we are also concerned about reports of widespread censorship, including blocks on global search engines, which severely limit the content available. Reports also indicate that there are widespread and growing content restriction and ban on messaging apps when accessing the internet, and there are fines can be issued for searching prohibited materials, including the use of virtual private networks to bypass restrictions. So I would like to hear the state party's responses on this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, very briefly, I just want to ask you if you could provide us some more disaggregated data, particularly on the issues I was interested in, on these territories of traditional resource use, how many are really registered, and also the indigenous peoples register. That would be very helpful. Also, the question, if you could provide us with some data on the development of Central Asian workers, maybe being replaced by other workers from other regions, and maybe some reasons for that. I would be interested in getting some disaggregated data also on this. And the last question is again on this aging society. I was asking for the budget consideration. Yeah, when the society is becoming older, that would mean something fundamental for the budgets also. Yeah, so you say it's all provided, but just to know a bit about the income side on this. Yeah, so how to manage this. Thanks.
Ms. Perez.
Señora Presidenta.
Thank you, Chair. Two questions on this cluster. There's a certain stagnation of investment in scientific research, and that could lead to a reduction of people's adequate access to scientific benefits under Article 15 of our covenant. Do you have any comment to make in terms of future plans for that investment? And coming back to a detail under health, what availability is there in terms of real access to medicines, contraceptive, emergency contraception medication? Thank you.
Thank you. That closes our list of questions, Your Excellency, and 20 minutes if you can kindly respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the additional questions. I will start as regards Ms. Chen's questions on the food provision for the younger classes that continues throughout our schools. That's a legal requirement from classes 1 to 4, children from age 7 to 10. They get 2 meals, in other words, breakfast and lunch, and it's hot food. And that's funded by state funds. Parents don't have to pay. Coming to Ms. Konai's question, LGBTI children's rights in school. What I would say is that there's no issue there, because all protection of children in schools from bullying and other harassment
you.